First question right here.
Hello, my name is Leroy Moore. I'm from the National Minorities with Disabilities Coalition and a longtime advocate for mental health services. I have many questions, but I'll keep it short. I have first question to Pam, and I realized I think a couple weeks ago that the President's Committee just wrote their report on mental health, and what's coming down, if it comes down, looks really oppressive to people with mental health, especially on youth of color. Talking about like drug testing and all that. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what's your comment about that, and how would that affect state too, because it's coming from federal to the states.
This is something that you can answer.
And again, would you just say, because what the impact of that law, the impact of if it does come down and is passed, is what again specifically?
The effect of that law. Well, one effect. There's many effects, but the effect of that law, it would include drug testing for youth going into schools that have mental health disabilities.
Oh, that have mental health and disabilities, that they would be drug tested.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think the requirements for everyone, right? The drug testing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so,
it is. It's still kind of oppressive. I mean, I don't have the full, document, but just reading, bullet points of it, it sounds really oppressive to people with mental health disabilities.
Right, I would say that any law that requires something like drug testing is going to be have a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities. I'm trying to find the cultural competency angle here.
Well, one of the things I might add with Pam is that I think about, when we think about drugs and drug testing, I think about this pernicious cycle, particularly for youth, and particularly for youth of color, in terms of, those of you who don't know, by the way, on page 15 of this handout, if you were fortunate to get that, and my colleague here was kind to hand this to me. If you look on page 15, there's also some kind of selected resources and references, including the Surgeon General's report, Surgeon General David Satcher's really great document on disparities. But another one that's not on here, which Pam probably knows, is also the Youth Law Center in San Francisco, and I think there's a National Youth Center. They had this document that is probably a little bit, maybe 3 or 4 years old, but talked about something's called the Color of Justice. It was called, and it was a 10-year, just my brief summary, a 10-year document that looked at the incarceration rate and looked at the seriousness of sentencing of different youth across a 10-year age span. And if you can imagine, what it actually showed was that for youth with equivalent levels of crime, okay, particularly after 3 strikes, is that what would you predict? That African American in particular, and African American and Latino youth, even though they had similar crimes, whether it be a felony, whether it be misdemeanor, of the same level, that they received harsher sentences. They oftentimes were placed out of home for longer periods of time. They were often put oftentimes tried as adults and sentenced as adults. And therefore, what we saw is a sort of a legal endorsement of the breakdown of the African American family, is what I thought. So I go there only because I think with the drug enforcement and then poverty issues and how there's a connectedness to it about a contribution to that cycle, if you will, of a pernicious cycle of downward spiral of our youth of color.
And that also raises an interesting link between cultural competency in the health and mental health care sector and cultural competency in the legal sector, where we have cultural competency issues in our court systems as well, and it can lead to people being and it does lead to people of color being disproportionately sentenced to to different crimes than other people would be for longer times. And the same issues that we talked about apply to lawyers and judges and social workers and other people who work in the court system. And especially for people with mental health needs who end up in the court system, and they do disproportionately end up in the court system, it's important that we're culturally competent both in the clinical setting and also in the legal setting, and that's a whole other area of discussion.
And I have one more question.
Sure.
On the local level, although we have the Mental Health Act, which is long overdue,
Yes.
people in San Francisco, so they mental health disabilities have been, I think, mistreated by like Proposition N, and every year forced treatment comes back to the ballot. So, you know, what is your suggestions on constantly fighting these on legislators on a local level that really touch on people's mental health issues more broadly than the federal level?
On a local level.
Well, I would say that advocacy at the local level is now linked inextricably to the Mental Health Services Act and the county mental health plans, which do very specifically have to have cultural competency requirements in them. So anyone who's advocating on the local level is now has their county mental health plan to look at, and whether it's been, you know, they're not approved yet, they're all in process. But it's important to have had impact in developing it, but if it's too late for that, to actually be aware of what's in your county mental health plan and make sure that all of your local laws comply with what's in there.
I appreciate your questions, and they could certainly be expanded upon, but if you look at the handout that also passed out, which I know I borrowed from you, my colleague here, is that if you look on page 13 and 14, it has legal mandates that talk about federal statutes as well as state statutes. And some of them, Pam was very articulate in terms of laying out. I would go to these, first of all, and also continue to, you know, address these through advocacy in terms of rights, including client rights. I also think we're in an incredible time with the Mental Health Services Act, because they're saying, and everybody's scrambling right now because money's tied to it, is that we have to transform the mental health system, which is transforming other service systems, because mental health, I think that meaning the youth that I'm talking about, maybe there's substance issues or substance use issues, poverty issues. Those are mental health issues that we need to address, and that we would be far better to spending funds that way in terms of care and for care for the families rather than an incarceration and imprisonment system, which is just a pernicious cycle. So right now, in the local level, is a transformation in the mental health system. It's your voice that's actually going to be out there. It says, what would you like? What would you like it? What will it look like? What would you see as positive outcomes for all of us as a community that really say that we have transformed the mental health system? And if we fall short, there are these public tax dollars that are essentially contingent upon this being done right. So you all being here as advocates, you all being here as family members, you all being as clients, this is an incredible opportunity that we all have to push together to push that boulder, right?
So,
okay.
And I look forward to asking more questions of the speakers after a 5-minute break. There's a video of the presentation, and they need to change the tape. So in the meanwhile, if you have questions, please think of them, and be sure to raise your hand after the break.
And I'm going to put my materials out on the table outside.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for coming back,
Thanks.
everybody.
Okay, so we're going to be getting started again soon. I hope you thought of some really good questions, or even just comments from your own experience that you might want to get feedback from the panelists or even other people in the room.
I could mention, but then you can probably it's going to be some
Okay.
easier for you to, registration. You can
Okay, I'll read this.
also the evaluation.
Okay, great. And I've been asked to read this statement. So for attorneys who wish to get minimum continuing legal education certificates, please be advised that they will be available at the conclusion of the seminar. And for psychotherapists, the sign-up sheets are also outside the door. We encourage all people who are not attorneys or who are not interested in continuing legal education credits to sign in on the non-attorney sign-in sheet on the registration table outside the door. Feedback is very important to us. Before you leave, please fill in the evaluation form and return it to the People with Disabilities Foundation.
Thanks for being here. Penny?
Yes.
I think some people said that they were short of handouts. I wonder if we should pass around a sheet or something.
Oh, sure.
How many of you didn't get handouts? Quite a few. I apologize. We're so sorry. We'll pass around a sign-up sheet, okay, for people. Is there one in the back? They have one in
Yeah,
the
there's
door?
a sign-in sheet at the door, so maybe if you leave your email with the registration table, we can email people with the PowerPoint presentations.
Okay.
Yeah, to prove that crisis really is opportunity, this way you can get both sets of PowerPoints. You can get the one that I took mine from, which is the one about kids, and then you can get what you were supposed to see, which is mine, which has a little more information in it that applies to people other than kids, and we can give you both if you want.
So I know earlier people said they were here from either the social service or mental health practice community, or were legal or consumer advocates. We'd be interested to hear of maybe experiences that you'd want to share with us today, and maybe get some feedback from our panelists.
I have a question, Stephen Bruce. Recently, I had a client trying to get on Social Security disability, and we had a hearing with a federal administrative law judge with 2 doctors and a third person testifying. And I had asked him to order what's called a consultative examination, because even though she spoke some English, it seemed like Cantonese was the correct language in order to get a diagnosis. The testifying psychiatrist basically said at first there's no severe problem with her. And the point is that she was being treated at an HMO, and they coded her as bilingual. And it is true that she spoke some English. But I thought it interesting when I was reading the chart. At one point, she was reporting seeing ghosts. And from her, let me say, possibly cultural point of view, and my question is going to be partly, is this cultural? I wasn't sure how a non-Cantonese speaking psychiatrist could interpret her having these visual hallucinations. It turned out that there was major depression, and they wanted to do ECT, which is electroconvulsive shock treatment. And when I showed the judge that, they backed down a little bit. And it turned out that the ghost, let me just say, through some kind of translation, she was seeing masks of unidentified people who were making fun of her for not being able to work. And this was really what the hearing was about. Can she work? Her husband had left her because she couldn't work, and the being made fun of was something that scared her and exacerbated the problem. My question really is that I was unsuccessful in getting a Cantonese speaking therapist at the Kaiser HMO, and because they just coded her bilingual, which was true. And since Title VI doesn't apply to federal agencies, except maybe by executive order, the judge denied my request to send her to such a bilingual psychiatrist. What is it that you would recommend someone in that situation do? In other words, the HMO has the interpreters, they have the translators for the forms and the consent forms, but even the psychologist who said he couldn't do psychometric testing recommended a Cantonese English psychiatrist. And the reason he couldn't perform the psychometric testing was due to the severity of her depression. It was at that point of psychotic proportions. But the HMO's position was the same. She's bilingual, and they're not going to do it, even though their own clinical staff was recommending. So my question is, what do you do in a situation like that? It was requested by me, through me, to Kaiser. The patient. The consumer requested it, and
So maybe we can have
it was
Pamela.
denied.
Should we get Pamela to answer
I
this
think
one?
Pam or Dr. Mock, either one who can address this situation, because in my Social Security practice, getting the diagnosis and resulting functional limitations is not always easy when someone is from a different cultural background.
I think we can both probably comment on this. I just want to make sure I understand the question. I'm hearing two questions. One is about whether or not she really is bilingual or whether she's limited English proficient. And that's what we lawyers like to say, a question of fact. Either
Clearly limited English proficient, but on the other hand, the provider uses a coding system as bilingual, and it is true that she speaks some English.
well, that's what's to challenge then. Is I assume it's the HMO's definition of bilingual that they're going after the managed care company. Wherever that bilingual definition comes from, someone needs to go back and look and see where the source of that definition of bilingual is, because bilingual should not be speaks a little bit of English. Bilingual should be proficient in 2 languages. So that on that issue, that's what I'd look at. Then the other issue is her practitioner competent to give her therapy on the issue of seeing ghosts or seeing people laughing at her? I think that there's an issue here, or maybe I'm reading into your question, I'm not sure, is you can, even if you get the right interpreter for her or you get someone who speaks Cantonese, the person might not understand, especially if the person speaks Cantonese but isn't from a Cantonese background, might not understand the intricacies of her hallucinations because somehow they're culturally bound, or am I reading too much into this question?
Well, no, I'm listening to what you're saying. I should add that they refused to provide not only a Cantonese English therapist, but an interpreter in the treating session either. They wouldn't provide. The interpreter was just outside at registration, not inside with the doctor's appointment.
May I ask if she was a Medi-Cal patient? Because I think there was some managed care contract information.
In this situation, no, it was not. The individual got to the comp unit of Kaiser, so it was covered by a contract the comp carrier had with them. It wasn't Medicare or Medi-Cal.
But there are still rules about what managed care companies have to provide in terms of linguistic accessibility, and that's what would cover that situation if all we're talking about is Kaiser. There is definitely an obligation for them to provide an interpreter for her if she needs it, and tracing it back to the definition of bilingual sounds like what the issue is here. But then there is this interesting question of if they find her an interpreter, whether that person's still culturally competent to deal with this issue, and that's more Dr. Mock's area.
We agree with this, yeah? Having an interpreter is only the second, the other option to use, right? Because an interpreter, even if it's a sound it's a good interpreter, that's not equivalent to absolute best care. And I think that people mistake that and say, well, because I have somebody who's an interpreter, then obviously they understand. Because we understand, as I feel very strongly, is that, as you were saying, Pam, I think referring, is that there's conceptual differences. And how do you address conceptual differences when you may have language differences, but then how do you conceptualize things differently if you're thinking that you're using the equivalent word? I'll give you 2 examples. One, in terms of interpreter, is that I had a Korean patient that I was going actually for medical care, and they said that they were going to do medical care for this individual and who was in a severe accident or had let a situation go till it got very, very severe, and it turned out they had to do some emergency surgery. And they turned to the child. This is not what you're exactly saying, but they turned to the child because they didn't have anybody who spoke a particular language, which actually was Korean at the time. And actually they did try to do some interpretation. They said, great. Before they knew it, and this is no lie, this is actually a real situation, is they actually started to amputate the well leg, the good leg, off this woman before they realized, in fact, that it was the other leg that they needed to amputate, okay? The other thing that came up was I did work with a trauma situation in which a mother was grieving over her child who was beaten to death by a Laotian gang in Berkeley. And she was very upset, and they wanted to hospitalize her and give her a 5150 because she was not eating, she was not sleeping, she was wailing, she was mourning in the most painful way that I, one of the many situations in my career. And I remember trying in my own way, thinking that I could treat her, but with medication that I thought would help her to sleep, antidepressants. Turned out, she didn't take the antidepressants. She said, "Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to our house. I apologize for inconveniencing you." When I did consultation finally with someone of her culture, okay, she was a Cambodian culture. We got a Buddhist monk to come out who actually spoke her language, and we went to where her son was beaten to death by this other group, and we did a ritual on the Berkeley Marina. We actually did a ritual. Because we actually did a ritual to bring back the spirit. Because her fear was that her son's ghost, because her son's ghost was beaten, because he was beaten to death and he was no longer physically there, that his ghost would forever be wandering the Berkeley Marina, cold and not have food. And so she said, what I really want most of all is I want a ritual. I would like to have a ritual to help his ghost, to help his spirit find a final resting place. I tell that story to trainees, I tell that sometimes in court, I tell it in other situations. Talk about care that's more culturally sensitive, more culturally competent, less costly, and not to mention also legally, think about the lawsuits. If she went ahead with ECT and the other, I hope that she does, to go ahead and treat her or mistreat her through this misdiagnosis. And oftentimes I find that oftentimes the case is not necessarily that there's no diagnosis, but oftentimes like a differential diagnosis, the person's being treated more severely because of how other people view the situation, rather than in terms of a cultural framework that the person needs treatment because they've been traumatized or been through some difficulties, but not in as severe way as maybe people are misunderstanding, okay?
And also that comes up when you talk about 5150s. Our civil commitment standard for psychiatric hospitals is danger to self, danger to others, or gravely disabled by reason of a mental illness or a mental disorder. Those standards should be interpreted and have been interpreted in the courts to be very specific to an inability, that the grave disability standard is the inability to provide for your own food, clothing, or shelter. And it is not wailing in a way that is intimidating to the people around you because you've never been to Cambodia. So this is a great example of somebody who, if you watched this person do what is in her natural in her culture to do as part of the grieving process, you might want to commit her because you might assume that she's out of control and unable to take care of herself. And judges very often misinterpret the commitment standard of grave disability to mean anything that scares them, the judge.
Yeah.
And it's very important, and this is another part of cultural competency that's important to understand, is that courts need to be very clear that they're being very specific about interpreting the legal standards.
I think particularly in this area too, Pamela, you need to also, from the very beginning, it's unfortunate it got to that point, but from the get-go for her to also have had other advocates, maybe, and that's as much as informing and us reaching out, us doing a better job informing the community that they can, even it's a Kaiser patient, but there's, Chinatown Child Development Center that does just two types of testing, and testing is a whole nother area. If you get me going, it's problematic because in terms of how it's set up, but others that can really, the Asian Law Caucus, some other advocacy groups that are very strong, Asian Community Mental Health Services, that are very strong and that could provide a different perspective from the get-go of, well, the diagnosis isn't as clear. Let's really, really get this right, and let's look at, so but advocating from the very beginning and setting up networks to do so, I think, is critical. Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions in the one in the back? And while Yuko goes, and there's a second one in front of him as well. I think the gentleman was first.
Oh, the gentleman? Okay.
Doesn't matter, I guess.
That's it. Oh. Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay.
There were two, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There were two very good examples that I'm aware of, and I wanted to ask you about some others, but I wanted to share these two. Years ago, at an independent living center where I worked, a Hispanic family came for it. This young disabled kid with a disability for intake, and they said, okay, we'll come see you now. Okay, you can come in here. And the whole family got up to come. They said, no, just him. We don't want the family, because this was, the independent living and so on. And so the whole family and the kid was out of there because they didn't want any part of that kind of a process. About a year ago, there was an all-day workshop on seniors here, and a woman had come up from LA with a very good example of how things can go haywire with language and culture. And that was, they'd spent millions and millions of dollars for a adult day health place for seniors to spend the day. And the literature, nobody was coming to that. They couldn't figure out, why isn't anybody coming here? It's wonderful. It's a great local resource. It's in the neighborhood. Well, the literature they sent out to the family members was, we will help with the burden of caring for your loved one. Well, in this Asian culture, it's not a burden, it's a responsibility that's welcomed. So it's very offensive language. So those are like examples, but I didn't get a packet. Are there resources of examples in your packet or examples in your packet or things you can talk about specifics that are of use? And that was question one. And number two is very quick. What about stigma in other cultures?
I was just thinking about that.
Around psychiatric disability and so I'll leave it at that and let you guys answer. Thanks.
I can speak to that from having lived in Japan for 2 years and studying the rights of psychiatric patients there. And also actually at the same time of being a parent of a baby who was under pediatric, routine pediatric care. So I was essentially a patient. I referred to the issue of informed consent, and that includes the issue of substituted judgment. In Japan, when I was there 12 years ago and still today, it's considered acceptable not to tell someone that they have a serious illness if the family member doesn't think that he or she can deal with the information. It's usually an older person who's the patient, where the family believes that grandpa really can't deal with the fact that he has cancer, and the family members will deal with how and when to give him that information. Now, that's absolutely unacceptable under American law. You can't not tell the patient what's wrong with them. So the issue that we deal with is here, if we have someone from a Japanese family and we have to talk to them and the family members, we're going to end up communicating more information to that patient than the family members are probably comfortable with. When that happens, the family members are going to want to be very involved in the care plan, the treatment decisions, more than what we're comfortable with. And so we have to figure out how to provide culturally competent care to someone involving their family members, but first determining whether the individual really wants that to happen. Because we have a focus on the individual, that culture has more of an emphasis on the family and the community. There's no real answer to this except to understand the tension between American civil rights laws, which are very individual focused and very information focused, and other cultures, either laws or just traditions, that are more about doing what is considered right for the person.
It's very interesting to bring up the issue of stigma, because now, Mental Health Services Act, there's community services and supports. The next thing that's coming up right now is prevention and early intervention. And one of the things about prevention and early intervention is how do you address things like stigma. And it's very interesting because, again, that box, okay? People say, well, what is stigma? Stigma is going out and informing people what mental illness is all about. And I say, no, that's not breaking down stigma. That's a unidirectional of saying this is what the mental health system is and this is what your son or daughter or you suffer from. Rather than stigma being more of outreach and engagement of understanding different conceptual viewpoints of what might be and be seen as different. Little vignette, remember my mother? My mother? Not to skip a beat, I missed a family reunion about 5 years ago, and my mother, everybody was around. She said, oh, unfortunately, my son is on the East Coast. He's giving a talk somewhere, but I want to let you know, I understand he's actually written books and all this stuff. I understand he's a wonderful podiatrist. Now, you might be offended, but at least she called me a doctor, okay? And maybe by the time I'm an elder, or by the time she's an elder, and she goes up an inch every time of the body, she would have got up to the heart and the head, which is more of what my training is. But what is the point? My point is that my mother will never see somebody like me for care. She would never see, and she has had challenges. She went through the rape of Nanking, among other things, is that she's had challenges, and challenges that she would not go to the public mental health system as currently constructed, and no amount of educating her about what that is will bring her in because of shame, stigma, because it is not an individual focus, but she would like to have it be more family focused, and one is that does not, quote unquote, blame her as a person or put the focus on her. So in this article, that in the handouts, I'm sorry we ran short, is I did have some partial solutions. I always call them partial, because we need to continue to find more, is that that we have an increasing number of research, and research, fortunately, that's out there, to include consumers and family members in policy making, being more open and involving consumers in constructing the very system that we're supposed to be responsive to, of acknowledging prevention and early intervention, particularly in places where families go, like maybe in faith systems or in situations where they go for faith practice, religious practice, other healing practices, maybe in terms of health. And definitely we're really talking more, looking at primary care. Looking at primary care and really advocating and seeing what primary care and really understanding more what manifestations of what we might refer to as emotional, mental, or other kinds of challenges of how they might be worked differently. So some of us are saying we should look into primary care situations as really taking a proactive stance rather than making a reactive one, which is potentially more costly. Okay? So thank you. I have more to say, but I know we have time.
It's 3 o'clock, but we're gonna go until 3:10 because we got a late start. And there is one more question.
I have one comment on what Matthew just said, which is there's a corollary is that Matthew's mother won't come to see me either. Because if she doesn't identify as a person, now I'm not saying Matthew's mother has a mental disability, but
Sure.
if she were to have a mental disability, she probably wouldn't identify herself that way because of the stigma that's attached in her culture. And if she doesn't identify herself that way, number one, she won't seek help from me if she's being discriminated against. Number two, even if she does seek help, under most laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, she won't be able to get help unless she identifies herself as a protected person, which would be a person with a disability. So 2 weeks ago, I went to Chinatown and I did what we call an outreach at a senior center for Chinese people, women mostly of Chinese descent, and it was really fun. I really enjoyed it, but I realized I'm talking to people about disability discrimination, and it's highly unlikely that any of them are actually going to end up coming to me, but all we can do is spread the word and let them know that we're out there.
Here's a Mental Health Services Act, Merced. The director went out to Merced and said, what I want to do is I want to figure out what ethnic individuals who are not getting in the door need, particularly under the Mental Health Services Act. So we went to one Hmong shaman, because there's an increase of Hmong, because the community goes oftentimes in groups, they follow their community leaders, in Merced. And the Hmong shaman, the leader, said, well, what I think you would, if you really want to know about mental health, if you really want to impart information, come and I will come out to the hills where you've never been before. I'll tell you how to get there, and I will have people there for you to meet. So the director, who had never been up in the hills before, never been in this area, went, and he had 54 Hmong shaman from all around the area meet with him. And so as he started to talk about what mental health is, they said, well, wait a second, if you really want to engage the Hmong shaman, let's start at a different place and let them tell you about Hmong culture. And let us tell you what has happened to us in our area, in our region, and what has happened about our spirit. And he went away with and I have a similar story about Native American culture, but for a community. He started at a totally different place and had a totally different appreciation about what it means to have mental wellness in the Hmong community. And he said, well, rather than construct a mental health clinic where they come and see me, I'm going to actually work out in the field in the hills, because for them, a place where they can meditate, a place where they can actually spiritually reconnect with what was lost, that's what they want. And they don't want to do it one by one. They would like to do it as a supportive group together. Talk about an argument for somebody that's efficacious, somebody that's culturally responsive, somebody that's less costly, something that has more a chance of effectiveness because of the community support for it. You see? So.
And by the way, speaking of the Hmong and Merced, I'll let you ask your question, but I just want to make sure everyone knows about this incredible book. You probably all do, by Anne Fadiman, called The Spirit Catches You and Then You Fall Down, or The Spirit Catches You, Then You Fall Down. It's not about mental illness, it's about epilepsy, but it's a true story of a girl with epilepsy and from the Hmong community in Merced and what it was like trying to get help. Healthcare from people who didn't understand the culture. It's written by a journalist. It's incredibly balanced and well written. It's one of my favorite books in the world, so read it.
I apologize. You've been very
Go
patient.
ahead.
I'm sorry. It's that passion thing. You know?
I have a question about psychiatric disability and the legal system. And I'm a psychotherapist, and I've been working more and more with the homeless population. And what I see in a lot of clients is severe trauma histories and PTSD and dissociative disorders. And then when those clients get in touch with the legal system and they go into their survival mode, into their fight, flight, or freeze response or something like that, and then they get involved with the legal system, as we know by now, then the neocortex and the cognitive processing and the rational thinking and the logical acting is shut off in that moment. So I, as a mental health practitioner, say, of course this person is fighting back. They are dissociated right now. And they're still getting in trouble with the legal system, and they may not understand it, their family may not understand it. So I'm really struggling with this. And what I'm finding is that with the public health system, there seems to be very limited knowledge about the effects that trauma has on people in situations like that. And I've had incredible trouble, for example, finding a psychiatrist who's in the public health system in San Francisco who does have experience with dissociative disorders. I'm hoping that you could give me some advice on how I could help those clients.
Oh man, that's such a big question, and there's not enough time to really answer it, but I'll just kind of throw out what angles I see in it, and then we can talk afterwards if you want to talk more about it. But from the legal perspective, number one, there are too many people with mental illnesses of all kinds, PTSD, trauma, everything in the legal system, in the criminal justice system, because people are picked up for things that they wouldn't be picked up for otherwise. Many of them are petty misdemeanors, things that would otherwise go ignored because the police want them to go somewhere. Number two, the police do not understand how to interact with people who have mental disabilities, especially dissociative disorders, when they are arresting them, bringing them in, going through all the different stages of the process. Lots has been written on this. I've written about it. Other people have written about it. I see it, I wrote about it as an ADA issue, which is a little bit out there, but it's a failure of the police to provide accommodations to people with disabilities the way that they should, and sometimes with the result of shooting them when they think they're not cooperating, when in fact they're not understanding. And then also the legal system, once you're in the legal system, there's the whole issue of mental health courts, which is very controversial. And then there's also the issue of legal accommodations that the court system has to provide. So if somebody is in the middle of a trial or even at another stage of the proceedings and is having trouble dealing with those proceedings because of their mental disability, the court owes an obligation of reasonable accommodation to that person, and that's like a whole seminar.
Yeah. I would have to agree, other than my first response is I relate to that very well, and I think there's couple of different pressure points that we, as advocates and professionals, I take a stance, by the way, I think that all of us should be engaged in trying to achieve social justice, no matter what position. We're a therapist, whether a community member, client, attorney, so on, but that acknowledging how the systems that, as they are set up for only certain individuals, and that to acknowledge that there are trauma organizations that we should be aware of. We should hit the guilds, psychologists, and to acknowledge that for ethically addressing the needs of people of diverse backgrounds, particularly those marginalized, that are not just people of color, but other people who are less power, to acknowledge how practitioners would be best to do so and to serve as advocates. I agree also with what Pam said, is that I used to work in Berkeley, that fortunately they have a mobile crisis team. And the mobile crisis team are mental health professionals that work with the police, and we engage in ongoing training with the police to become better practitioners, even though they're not therapists, but to understand differential responses. Because after all, a lot of folks and a lot of communities, all the more, and in these times, would be neglectful to not acknowledge these painful times that we live in, these tumultuous times that we live in worldwide, is you have folks that are coming in from systems that are fearful of the legal system. What it's supposed to be helpful maybe to them to acknowledge benefits, again, to think about going to the legal system based on their backgrounds, oftentimes immigrant or sometimes maybe undocumented, it brings up another fright. So I always bring up the situation about acknowledging trauma, particularly maybe in past and history or in developmental, but also in trauma in current situations, in living, sometimes in just living in the current situation, homeless and the like, and to really start to sort out those traumas and to give voice to them. So not an easy solution, but I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Okay.
Okay?
We have time for one last question.
I'm sorry, just one more quick comment. You said you had some articles about that. Is there any possibility to get access to those?
In terms of, let's see, in terms of trauma literature, or what specifically? Some of it is in the handout.
I didn't get those.
In reference to, but if you take a look at particularly, maybe something like including like the Surgeon General's report, which you can get on the SAMHSA, off the SAMHSA website. It's called Mental Health, Culture, Race, and Ethnicity, www.surgeongeneral.gov. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we have time for one last question.
I just wanted to say that I've been in that situation that you have, Pamela, of speaking to, in particular, Asian groups in Chinatown and in downtown Oakland about the ADA and their rights under the ADA, and I have had that experience where I've had trouble sort of trying to get across to them their rights and trying to figure out how we can get people to be a little more assertive in their rights. And I think there's just so many issues tied to immigration and culture and language barriers that I've heard about at all of these meetings I've had. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips about how to address those things.
This is a very controversial issue in my office and in all legal advocacy offices. My view may be different from, I can't really speak for PAI on this because everyone has different ideas on it. My personal idea is that, and maybe this comes from living in Japan, we are not going to make 75-year-old Chinese women aggressive and assertive about their legal rights. And I think that's kind of not necessarily an appropriate thing for us to try to do because they just may not be. Now, some of them, here we have a passionate male Chinese person. Yes. There may be assertive 75-year-old Chinese women out there. I'm sure there are, but on the whole, we have to accept that this is how they're going to be. I think it's still important to talk to them about what it is that we do because, number one, a few of them may decide they need to assert something. Number two, it may make them more comfortable about identifying a disability that they have, and that may not be a legal issue. That may help them go seek help somewhere. Having a lawyer come in and say, you are protected in America because you have a disability may say, wow, maybe I should go try to get some help for my depression. It may, eventually though, that generation is going to die off, and the people who have been here longer are going to be more accustomed to the way that Americans look at civil rights issues. And so when you deal with younger people or people who've been here longer, you have different attitudes. So I can't assume that whenever I talk to somebody who's from an Asian culture that they're going to have that kind of typical framework, and the longer they've been here, the chances are that they don't. So I don't know how helpful that is. Some people in my office would say, go out and hammer at them so hard that they'll come to you for help.
If I may, by the way, could I have the switch to the overhead? Is that possible? Is that person gone?
We don't have the
The
technology.
person's left. Okay. Okay, I'm being punished for not having more PowerPoint. But is that we have a lot of work to do, and I really appreciate people going out to my community or our community to try to advocate. And I'd say it's really a hard issue about, I think, also looking at who the community elders are and also who the community leaders are, and having an ongoing, not just a presentation, which is easier said than done, but of identifying who those community leaders are, and also not just the ones that are like heads of agencies or programs, but also those that are informal ones, which you could do if you just ask people in the neighborhood, say, who is it you rely on, who is it you go to, who is it you trust? And you get those elders to really help to voice the very thing that we need for people. And to have that as an ongoing working relationship, because it's not going to be easy. Because we've been taught, about assertiveness. This is always, I say, the dictum is a nail that sticks up and we pound it down. Yeah. And it's just not that. I say it's not that we're not assertive. I think that we are assertive, but in some of the ways in which we need to push through of how much we make a fuss that inconveniences other people, which actually somewhat comes up somewhat culturally. So yeah. I always tell people that I think that we're differently assertive than others in a way. And if I had a time, this is my little ditty at the very end. I'm not sure if you can see this, but it says, it's a little flower, and it says, if you think you're too small to be effective, you've never been in bed with a mosquito. Okay? And then the last little ditty goes like this, and I dedicate this to my daughter. And I'm glad, again, you did show children's sides, because I dedicate all these things to my daughter, who's 14 years old, who teaches me everything about what it means to be a male and be, in terms of being a man, in terms of social justice. It's called That's Not My Job. I'll read it out. This is a simple story about 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, I'll say cultural competency in care and health care. Everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought that anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have. The author is unknown. You may have heard this before. I put, maybe it was written by everybody, somebody, anybody, nobody, or. The point, I've read this many times. The point is that it's everybody's job, and I think we'll say, I really appreciate all of you being here. I really appreciate my colleagues, Hemi, and also Pam, and Stephen, and Yuka for inviting us, and thank you for your presence for this. I'll let Hemi wrap up here, but again, let's make it all of our job, and again, think outside the box, okay? So, thanks.
You could do-